Good evening, virtual audience, and welcome. Thank you for tuning in tonight. My name is Kate Bruns, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore and our co-sponsor tonight, Boston Review, I am truly honored to introduce this Green New Deal and Climate Action panel discussion with Senator Ed Markey, joined by Robert Hockett, Alyssa Battistoni, David Victor, and Thea Riofrancos, moderated by Boston Review's Joshua Cohen. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors, leaders, and visionaries to our community during these unprecedented digital times. In January, we will be back to hosting virtual events like tonight's 5 times or more a week. You can find our event schedule at harvard.com/events, where you can sign up for our email newsletter and browse our bookshelves from home. This evening's special panel discussion will run for 75 minutes and will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our panelists at any time during the talk tonight, please submit it through the Q&A button, which you can locate at the bottom of your screen. We're going to get through as many as time allows for. In a couple of minutes in the Zoom chat box, I'll be sharing links to purchase tonight's featured book, Climate Action from Boston Review. I will also be sharing a donation link for Harvard Bookstore. Thank you from the bottom of our book-selling hearts for your patronage during this difficult time. It makes this author series possible, and now more than ever, ensures the future of a landmark independent bookstore. And finally, as you might have experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues can arise, and if they do, we will do our best to resolve them quickly. So thank you for your patience and your understanding. And so now I am very excited to turn things over to our moderator tonight, co-editor-in-chief of Boston Review, Josh Cohen, the author of On Democracy, Rousseau, The Arc of the Moral Universe, and other essays, and more. His writing concentrates on issues of democratic theory, freedom of expression, political equality, and global justice. So without further ado, Josh, the digital podium is yours.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Kate. I want to also, and Ed, you can turn your video back on now. There you are. Good to see you. I want to welcome everybody to this forum jointly sponsored, as Kate said, by Harvard Bookstore and Boston Review. And on behalf of the Review, which I've been editing and now co-editing since 1991, I want to express gratitude to Harvard Bookstore for providing this great opportunity. We're going to have an important conversation about a really profoundly consequential issue. We're going to be discussing the existential threat presented by climate change and ideas about a constructive response to that threat that our participants have been urging as the right way forward. We have an incredible group of participants, Massachusetts Senator Ed Markey, David Victor, professor at University of California, San Diego, where he co-directs the Deep Decarbonization Institute, Alyssa Battistoni, who's an environmental fellow at Harvard and co-author with Kate Aronoff, Daniel Cohen, and Thea Riofrancos of A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal. In addition, we have Thea Riofrancos, one of the aforementioned co-authors of that book, who teaches political science at Providence College. And we have Bob Hockett, who's the Edward Cornell Professor of Law at Cornell University and author of Financing the Green New Deal. The occasion for this conversation is that Boston Review just published a fantastic book called Climate Action. The book has a lead article by David Victor and Chuck Sable from Columbia Law School. It has contributions by Alyssa, by Bob, by Thea, and also by Catherine Coleman Flowers, Leah Stokes, David Wallace Wells, Alexis Pauline Gums, and a number of other equally fantastic, amazing, creative people. Climate Action, you can get it at bostonreview.net. We're really thrilled to have Senator Markey with us at this party. By the way, Ed, congratulations on your recent re-election. I think it's great news for all of us. And I know how hard you fought, because I saw you out here in California when you were running about 10 or so points behind, and it was really wonderful to see the results. We have Senator Markey for about 30 minutes, so I thought we'd start with you. So you are, as everyone knows here, along with Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, You introduced the Green New Deal resolution, which Bob Hockett helped to draft. The resolution called for a 10-year national mobilization that would get us to 100% clean, renewable energy. And I wonder if you could start off with a few words about how you see the prospects for progress on the Green New Deal with the Biden administration taking office in, roughly 1,030 hours from now.
Thank you, Josh, so much. And thank you for putting together this incredible all-star cast tonight. And that's just Harvard Bookstore and Boston Review in a nutshell, the very fact that you're able to gather these kinds of incredible people. And David Victor, thank you for helping to author Climate Action, because that's the basis for us all being here today, along with just the issue of the existential threat which the climate crisis poses to our planet. So, as Josh just said, I was in a big race this year in Massachusetts. The initial polls had me down by 14 points to Congressman Kennedy, but I was running on the Green New Deal. I was running on climate action and the need to have a response which was equal to the magnitude of the problem. In 2018 in Massachusetts, in a Democratic primary, 12% of the vote was age 18 to 34, 12%. In 2020, 20% was age 18 to 34. And what we did was we just focused on climate, we focused on racial justice, we focused on economic justice, and the turnout was absolutely amazing. And from my perspective, they've got a big IOU now. Young people showed up all across the country this year, and they want fundamental change. So just going back a little bit in time, on February 7th, 2019, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and I introduced the Green New Deal. We had a lunch in the Senate dining room in the first week of December of 2018, about 4 weeks after she was elected to the House. So she and I had a lunch for about 2.5 hours, talking about a Green New Deal, talking about how we could frame it and develop it. And then about 8 weeks later, in the first week of February of 2019, we released the Green New Deal. Nothing has been the same since then, nothing, because it just injected an energy into that issue that it had never seen before. And a lot of it was generational. Young people just rose up at high schools, middle schools, colleges all across the country, young people joining with an older generation of activists, but just injecting just incredible amounts of passion into this issue. And there's a good reason why they did it. The planet is running a fever, and there are no emergency rooms for planets. So we have to engage in preventative care. And that preventative care is wind and solar and all electric vehicles, all of these technologies which are there. And we have to do it with environmental justice, which is what we wrote into the Green New Deal, AOC and I. We wrote it in very explicitly that anything that we do has to be done with intersectionality, has to be done with frontline communities being put at the front of the line, has to be very, very aware of the fact that communities of color have always been disproportionately impacted by pollution in our society. Black and brown families have historically breathed different air than suburban white families have breathed. We put it all in the Green New Deal. It was only 14 pages long, but so much of it was about environmental justice as well. And talking about who is impacted by it, right? And it's people at the local level, not just here in the United States, but all across the planet. It's people who are the most vulnerable, who are the most exposed. So for me, it was, absolutely imperative that Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez and I create a intergenerational compact on this. And we released it. And it drew Fox News, ExxonMobil, every right-wing group in America just started attacking immediately, calling it socialism. Socialism. And what did we say in response? Well, very clearly, what do you call 100 years of tax breaks for the oil, gas, and coal industry coming out of the pockets of taxpayers all across the country? You don't have to call that socialism. Just give some of that to us for wind and solar and all electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids and battery storage technologies and energy conservation and energy efficiency technologies. And we will bury the fossil fuel industry in a generation. Okay? Just give us that. Give us the regulatory favoritism and the tax breaks that you've had for 100 years. And you can call it capitalism if you want. You can call it socialism if you want. Just give it to us. And that's what has now unfolded, this incredible energy level. And it is something that has ultimately been embraced by Joe Biden. When Joe Biden went back this July to put together his new climate proposal, he asked Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Varshini Prakash, the executive director of the Sunrise Movement, to be in the room to draft the bill. And it's a $2 trillion energy infrastructure bill with 40% of the money going to communities of color, to frontline communities. So that wasn't on the school board on February 7th, 2019, when AOC and I introduced the Green New Deal. And I think it's very telling that President-elect Biden mentions climate change in every one of his speeches now as one of the top 4 things that he's going to be working on. And he named John Kerry, our home state, senator whose seat I now have, to be the special envoy to the world. And President Biden's also going to be naming a special domestic czar as well. And I feel very optimistic about what is unfolding right now. And by the way, just so I can say, I am right now in the Senate. I'm underneath the Senate floor right now in my hideaway office. And Elizabeth Warren and I were just upstairs voting against other Republican Heritage Foundation selected candidates for positions of high responsibility in our federal judiciary. So I apologize to you for being a little bit late, but we're still in session, and Elizabeth and I, we try our best to reflect what Massachusetts would want up on the Senate floor. So from my perspective, I have never been as optimistic. And I know that if we put the right appropriations policies, the right tax policies, the right regulatory policies in place, then it will happen. And it will unleash activity in every city and town all across the United States. For example, with Senator Van Hollen, I have a piece of legislation in an energy accelerator, a climate bank that could leverage upwards of $750 billion worth of investment that would go largely to the local level, where cities and towns, housing authorities, individual companies could apply for super low interest loans to install the energy efficiency technology, the renewable technologies, which they want to. So I just did actually a huge event earlier today with the group that's introducing that bill. But it's an example of the kind of creativity, the kind of public-private partnerships that are now developing, which are going to be at the core of solving this problem. So Joe Biden is already promising to have 500,000 charging stations deployed in our country. He's already promising to roll back all of Trump's fuel economy standards and to make them match the magnitude of the problem. I'm the author of the 2007 law, which President Obama used to set 54.5 miles per gallon as the goal. Trump's been rolling it back, but now, as you can see, Ford and General Motors, they're all They're all saying, I saw General Motors this week saying, no, 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 we don't actually believe in rolling back the standards anymore. We want to sign up with California. We want to do the right thing. So we can already begin to see the change of attitude, which is occurring in the private sector. Obviously, when you're ExxonMobil, when you're the remaining Koch brother, they're never going to give up. But we're in a position where we can make a big difference in the next 4 years. So that's my goal. That's why I'm so glad to be gathered with all of you this evening, this incredible gathering. Thank you, David, for helping to co-author this book. And thank you, Josh, for inviting me.
Josh, you're muted.
You're right. I was. Thank you. Thanks so much, Ed, for those remarks and for doing the people's work there with Senator Warren. I want to just I know you have a limited amount of time, and I just want to take a kind of speed round of comments focused on one thing that you said. You said you've never been more optimistic than you are now. And I would really like to know whether other people, the other participants here, share that that optimism that you're experiencing. And I just want to make one point, as you're thinking about what to say, I just want to shout out to there's a bunch of 8th graders from the McCormick School in Boston who are here, and they want to hear from you about what they can do. So thanks, Chris, for letting me know in Q&A about their participation in the audience. So David, maybe we'll start with you. Never more optimistic than you've been?
Yeah, it's incredible. It's very easy to explain inaction on climate change for long periods of time. Now we're in a totally different situation. And it's partly because we have the 8th graders from McCormick School, and we have all the people who showed up to vote. And, there's a lot of pressures. But I think, to me, what's interesting is it's not just pressure on government, but it's also pressure on business. Firms, a growing number of firms, you see this more in Europe now, the United States, but it's changing rapidly in the United States. I live in California, I see this in California. Firms are under pressure. They know they've got to do something. The lead essay that Chuck Sable and I wrote in this book is about how you actually act when you know you need to do something, but you don't really know what to do. And that's what the logic of experimentalism is all about, that we talk about in our essay. And the one thing I'd just say, to build on that briefly, is we have to make the case for government. The Green New Deal and these other big infrastructure investments, these are in effect about big interventions in government. And when government does this well, we're doing it in California, for example, and helping create the electric vehicle revolution. When government does it well, they do it in collaboration with business, but not letting business get away with murder. They actively run experiments. That's why we call our theory experimentalism. They run peer review, so we learn quickly what works, what doesn't work. And I think we have to make the case that government can spend these vast resources effectively so that the public will be with us and they'll see the benefit. They won't just see this as a Washington program, but they'll see this as a heartland program. And I think that's essential.
Great, thanks, David. Alyssa, never more optimistic than you've been before?
It's a tough question because on the one hand, yes, I feel maybe it's hard because the track record is to be very pessimistic on climate. So feeling even a little optimistic is always like more optimistic than I've ever felt before. So I completely agree with everything that Senator Markey has said about the sort of huge shift in climate, the climate conversation and the kinds of ideas that are on the table. It's very, very exciting, and that makes me feel really good. What I do feel very nervous about, to be very frank, is the gap between what our ideas are and what I think the vision is, and the sort of the roadblocks that remain and the power to achieve them. And it won't be a surprise to anyone the sort of continuing problem of the Senate, obviously to you, Senator Markey, is a really tough one of, what do we do if we don't have Democratic control of the Senate? And can we keep, I think my main concern is the idea that we would rely on a sort of Biden executive action focused climate presidency, which would certainly be better than, certainly better than the Trump presidency, and better than what we could have. But I really think that to sort of build on what David's saying, to show that that government can deliver real benefits, people can act, can do things that people want to be done, we have to be able to do some of the things that I think that's what the Green New Deal is all about, is showing that climate action can be linked to real improvements in people's lives and action on things that people care about in a direct way. And so I really, I think that's the thing that keeps me up the most, is how do we get to that next level where we're able to, and I'll say more about this in my comments on the book, because this is a lot of what I talk about there, but how do we get to that point where we can start to show people that we can have real improvements in what we think of as social issues that are connected to climate, and that is the promise of the Green New Deal to me.
If I can, Josh, I'd just like to check in here if I could. 10 years ago, we had 2,000 megawatts of solar. 2,000. That's where we were. And then we started to be effective at the local, state, federal level. Democrats, largely, some Republicans. We now have 80,000 megawatts of solar in the United States. 2,000 to 80,000. That's Moore's Law. It's taken over. In wind, we had 25,000 megawatts of wind. Now we had 100,000 as of January 1st of this year. Well, here's what happened this year. This is incredible. In 2020, between wind and solar, we will have installed 34,000 megawatts of wind and solar in 2020 alone. Now think about that. That's just 2020. Only 2,000 megawatts of solar total 10 years ago. The beginning of time to 10 years ago, 2009. Right? So the economies of scale are kicking in. The technology is getting more effective. I'll give you an interesting kind of little factoid. We were debating putting wind turbines in Nantucket Sound in Massachusetts 10 years ago. Big debate about it. Each one of those wind turbines could produce 1 megawatt of electricity. Vineyard Wind is now announcing that their wind turbines, if they can begin construction next year, 13 megawatts for every wind turbine, 13 megawatts, and they can put them 15 miles out to sea. So the economies of scale are kicking in. It's almost going to be not why do you do it, it's why don't you do it? Why don't you want technologies that are less expensive, that don't have meltdowns, that are consistent with what our goals are on climate change as well, and create jobs right now in Massachusetts and states all across the country. And I'll give you one other number, just pick a number. How many total electric vehicles were there in the United States in 2009? So just pick a number. Total electric vehicles in the whole country, 2009. Okay, you're wrong. The answer is we had 2,000 in 2000 and as we began 2009. We now have 1.5 million, and General Motors and Ford and Nissan and Volkswagen, they're all now making big promises about the next 4 or 5 years. None of that was on the school board. You needed Democrats. I'll have to admit it. You needed a few Republicans, but mostly Democrats. But the now almost unavoidable reality is that the global market has changed. In Europe, they're going to move. In China, they're moving. And we're going to have to move if we want to stay in this market. And so that's why I'm optimistic, but I know that we have to do a lot more to create the incentives at the local, state, and federal level. And that's why Joe Biden's executive orders and rolling back all 100 of the anti-environment regulations of Trump, of setting much higher goals for offshore wind, for wind and solar on public lands in the United States, and for Democrats, which is what I'm going to do, working with Republicans to try to create imaginative programs that we can get passed in the House and Senate and signed by President Biden. So I just think that we now have workers, jobs, economic activity on our side, and we're in the midst of a pandemic, and we're going to need a job creation program to get us out of it. And we can create like 5 million jobs. We can just see them very easily if we move to this clean energy agenda in a very telescoped timeframe. So that's going to be our responsibility. We have to make the case. but I think we now have all of the economic data that we did not have. We had a theory 10 years ago, and we believed our theory, and the theory has now come to pass, you know, and now we can argue not just theory, but reality in terms of where the jobs are, where the new jobs are, and how it can be the greatest blue collar job creation revolution in 2 generations in our country. So that's why I'm optimistic. Of course, you couldn't be in my business if you weren't an optimist. There's just too many things, counter factual, you know, situations that you see every single day, including Mitch McConnell being about 12 feet above me right here on the floor of the Senate right now. But I've seen how quickly we've telescoped the time frame, and so I just I thank Alyssa and David for doing all that they do, you know, to help to create this much different climate that we're in today than we were just really 10 years ago.
That's a great record, Ed. And, you know, how many pieces of legislation have you co-sponsored in your?
Well, I have 500 laws on the books, and I had to find a Republican each time, and then I had to find a president to sign it, but that's 500. But I'll give you an example though. Back, well, like I'm the author of the appliance efficiency law. Okay. And I go back a long time, 1987 law. That says to air conditioning companies, refrigeration companies, you just have to keep increasing the efficiency of your air conditioning. So for example, in Texas in the summer, 80% of peak demand is air conditioning. Well, if you double the efficiency of all air conditioners sold over the next 10 years, you've cut out the need for natural gas or coal burning plants, right? It's just working smarter, not harder. My mother always said she was going to donate my brain to Harvard Medical School as a completely unused human organ. Eddie, you have to learn how to work smarter, not harder. And that's what we have been able, I mean, she would be so happy that I'm talking to the Harvard Review and the Boston Review and the Harvard Bookstore right now. She'd just be so happy. Ma, I just want you to know, I got the Harvard Bookstore and I'm speaking at it. But the reality is that we have now demonstrated that working smarter is better than working harder. Oil and gas, that's working harder. Coal, that's working harder. You have all of the side effects, all of the pollution, all the health effects of it, which we have now made the public aware of. So I just think that the net result of our successes at the state, federal, and local level, a lot of it led by California and Massachusetts, is now something that's irrefutably true and is going to give us real leverage in the near term and the long term.
Great. Let me get Thea in here. We don't have a skunk at the garden party yet. We have a room full of optimists. Thea, you're going to join the club?
Yeah, I'm going to join the club. It's too infectious, the optimism. I'm feeling it. And I just want to sort of emphasize 2 things. One, definitely the Green New Deal, like such a watershed moment for unleashing all of this creativity of movements and of policymakers thinking how to connect climate politics to people's everyday material circumstances in ways that had apparently eluded like former climate policies prior to the Green New Deal. So I think it's such a moment and something to rally around. But I also want to sort of emphasize something Alyssa said, and maybe put a slightly different spin on it. I think we need to be very real about the obstacles. They're in the Senate, they're in Exxon, you know, they're in lots of places, right? Which for me just underscores the need for continued social movement pressure, which I think is sometimes controversial, like among Democrats or progressives. Like, for example, recently Sunrise has done a bunch of actions that targeted Biden appointees or were critical of Biden appointees, and that ruffled some feathers. But, you know, for me, I think like we got the Green New Deal because of decades or years of organizing. And we're only going to get things like the Green New Deal in reality, given the obstacles, if we have continued pressure on Biden and then also on like, you know, our enemies and opponents, right, who are in our way. So I'm actually optimistic in a way because of the fact that movements are keeping the pressure on, and they're keeping it on even before Biden gets into office. And I think that they'll continue to do so. We'll all continue to do so in the first 100 days of office and that sort of pivotal moment. So I'm optimistic to see people still in the streets and not sort of hanging up their hats after voting. And I think that's super important for getting a Green New Deal.
Great.
Thea mentioned the Green New Deal when I asked AOC to have lunch with me in the Senate dining room. So we talked for 2.5 hours. And a lot of it was about the Waxman-Markey bill, which is a 2009 bill, 1,400 pages long, that reduced greenhouse gases by 80% by the year 2050, that passed the House of Representatives 219 to 212, but it got stalled in the Senate. So what I said was, I know how to write a 1,400 page bill, but maybe we should write a 14-page bill. And maybe we should just create a movement. And the 8th graders from the McCormick School who are on today are part of the movement. That did not exist in 2009. That's all I can tell you. That was just Henry Waxman and I using our clout and our savvy after all the years on the committee to get it passed. But there was no real movement out there. We have a movement now. And it's a lot of these young people. And we should let these young people lead. They're leading on this, on all of these issues. And the McCormick School 8th graders are part of this leadership movement from this generation. And I think that that ultimately, yeah, it would be good if we win the 2 seats in Georgia, and that's what I'll be working on as soon as I get out of here, and continue to go to work on winning those 2 seats in Georgia, so that Kamala Harris breaks the tie on every vote for the next 4 years. And that's a best case scenario, and it's possible, and that's why I'm going to be working on it. But even if that doesn't happen, we still have a lot of great things that we can do, Josh. And the people who are on here are just they're like walking, talking antidepressants. You know what I mean? They just make you feel that, yeah, the future is ours. So thank you, Josh. And I apologize to you, but I've got to run back here into.
For you to apologize for, you've been leading a charge on this for a long time, Ed, and it's we really all appreciate it hugely, and we also appreciate your not only marking out the path in the past, but talking about all those specific accomplishments that have paved the road that people are walking and running on here. So thanks very much. I'm very grateful for you to.
Thank you all. Thanks for all your great work.
Thanks, Ed.
Good.
And McCormick School, you're the leaders.
Yeah. Tell that to some of your colleagues in the Senate. Bob, let me let you wrap up this round of optimism, and then we'll come to David back to experimental governance.
Yeah, just real quick. I mean, so I'm sort of metabolically optimistic, so I would probably be optimistic no matter what. But I can give you, I think, 3 reasons for being sort of cognitively optimistic as well, right off the bat. Right, the first is what the senator mentioned when it comes to the demographic story here. Right, I mean, it's, I think, quite fateful that the Green New Deal resolution was introduced in early 2019, February 7th, and that was the year that millennials officially supplanted baby boomers as the largest demographic in the country. And that's immensely significant for these purposes, because we now have, the greater part of the population is going to experience, very painfully the effects of climate change if we don't reverse it really quickly. So there's a real obvious stake, I think, that a lot of people have, and that's part of what's generating the movement, I think, even though it's not the whole of what's generating the movement. The second reason, I think, to be cognitively optimistic is that this is the first time in our modern history where the environmental movement converges with another very economically compelling movement or urgent need, and that is the rediscovery of industrial policy and the recognition by many that we have to rediscover the role of the state in guiding and in orchestrating ongoing national development, right? The biggest mistake, I think, intellectually in the economics profession from the 60s onward was to start thinking of development as a kind of a one-off achievement, right? You're undeveloped and you flip a switch and now you're developed. But, to quote the great development economist Robert Zimmerman, also known as Bob Dylan, he not busy being born is busy dying, right? And the same is true of economies. In order for an economy to stay viable, it has to be developing always, constantly. And we're sort of rediscovering that now, and we're rediscovering industrial policy in consequence. And it just so happens that by modernizing, by bringing our infrastructure and our industry into a state-of-the-art state again, that in its very self is going to render it much more green, right? Because new industries, new technologies are not whale oil lamps or even kerosene lamps, right? New technologies, almost by definition, greener technology. And then finally, the third reason I have, at least for being cognitively optimistic and not just metabolically, is that, you know, I've recently put together this 4-part plan for how to actually mobilize and get the Green New Deal going, with a sort of a plan A and a plan B for each of the 4 parts. The plan A is if we get the Senate. The plan B is if we don't use the Senate, and it's how to use existing institutions, the Treasury, the existing cabinet level departments, and the Fed. And it's very straightforward what we have to do and how to do this. And what's sort of fascinating to me is actually 21 members of this large number of Biden agency review teams that he's put together to review all of the various agencies with a view to what he can do, are actually expressing interest. I'm actually in regular conversations with members of these review teams now. And that's hugely weird for me, because remember, I was part of the Bernie team in 2016 and part of the Bernie team in 2019, 2020. And for all of these Biden people actually to be interested in these kind of goofy things that I have to sort of suggest or recommend, I think signals a real sea change. It shows that building back better really just is another phrase for the Green New Deal. Oh, sorry, you're muted.
There we are. Thanks, Bob. I share your metabolic optimism, but I'm glad to have some cognitive backing. For it. I should mention Boston Review actually has a book coming out next fall with co-produced with American Affairs on industrial policy with Julie
cool.
Frank's American Affairs. So we're right there with you. I want to turn now from the discussion we've been having about the Green New Deal to an optimism to the issues in the climate action book. And David has mentioned a few times, you and Chuck Sable wrote the lead article. The lead article defines what you call, and you referred to it earlier, experimental governance. So I thought maybe you could say a few words about what experimental governance is as a distinctive approach to this existential threat of climate change, and you know, how it's connected with and different from these aspects of the Green New Deal that we just have been discussing. So
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Josh. And let's not forget optimism, but let's get into some of the nuts and bolts. The cognitive nuts and bolts here. So I think Bob has actually begun to explain this already, and there's a lot of resonance between our notion of experimentalism and the way Bob has articulated it in his essay in the book. But the commitment to act and the sense of crisis is vitally important, because it's what puts pressure on government and on firms to not just do things at the margin, but to recognize that there needs to be a fundamental shift. And it's that fundamental shift that's really essential, because it forces firms, for example, to not just look at the normal playbooks and treat this as a corporate social responsibility activity and so on, because if they do that, they're going to get crucified in the market, they're going to get crucified politically. And so there's this kind of strong motivation to explore completely transformative ideas. And the logic that Chuck and I lay out in our essay, which is excerpted from a book that's coming out next year from Princeton University Press, is that then there's a very distinctive process by which the search for solutions occurs. It's a search that's usually collaboration between business and government, where both are motivated to find solutions, yet neither can explore the whole solution set on their own. They, in effect, run lots of experiments in a decentralized way, but then they engage in active peer review. So it's not just pure bottom-upism, which is, pure decentralization, and it's not centralization and central planning, which is central planning and Gosplan and all central peer review, but it's a combination of the two, where they learn very quickly what solutions work, what don't work, and you scale them up. And so that's the essence of the idea behind experimentalism that we're laying out. I think to me, what's interesting about, there are two extensions of this that are relevant, I think, for tonight's conversation. One is, what does this mean for the Green New Deal? And our argument is that it means the Green New Deal, we need to think about, in some sense, the language of the Green New Deal and all the politics and the warfare on the left and the warfare between the centrists and the left, and God knows only what's going on with the far right, that some of that's getting in the way of us recognizing, and the terms sometimes get in the way of recognizing that for this to work, it has to be a process that is experimentalist. So it has to be diffused. We have to learn quickly what works, what doesn't work. We have to also understand these investments in context so that they actually deliver on what people care about. So it's not just carbon, but it's environmental justice and a whole range of other topics. And so that's how we see the Green New Deal. And the last thing I'll say by way of extension is that actually most of our essays about what does this mean for international cooperation, where the same logic applies to the Paris Agreement, for example, is if Paris is going to work, it's going to work because it's helps to catalyze experimentalism all around the world. And I think we're seeing some evidence of that. We are concerned that there's been an overweighting of emphasis on the formal legal mechanisms and an underweighting of the kind of more informal processes that actually make this work. And this is one of the areas where I think US leadership could be really helpful as the Biden administration articulates its climate plan with all these people who are real experts on climate who are now taking positions of power, because we're going to have a hard time doing a lot of things inside the country because of the concerns that Alyssa raised quite rightly. But one of the things that we could offer that's very distinctive is how to actually spend large resources effectively and learn quickly. And what does that mean for a system of international cooperation that does that in effect globally?
Yeah. Great, thanks, David. Alyssa, you have a response to David and Chuck in the book, and you express some enthusiasm for their case about the limits of Paris. I mean, maybe we'll always have Paris, as Humphrey Bogart said, but it isn't everything it's cracked up. Maybe it's not everything it's cracked up to be. But you say you have two concerns about their vision. One, that you think that they don't really deal effectively with the opposition of fossil fuel companies to dealing with the climate. And the other is about the essential importance of popular support, and that they're not engaged enough with that issue of popular support. I wonder if you could say something about that. And just let me take one comment from the Q&A from Suzanne Laughlin, who says, what can we do to reduce the likelihood that the Green New Deal becomes a divisive political issue like mask wearing during the pandemic? So how do you get that popular support without getting even more opposition than you get support? Small question.
I'll do my best. Yeah, so to build on what you just laid out, Josh, I'll just start with the fossil fuel piece. And as you say, I really did appreciate the shift away from treating Paris as a sort of like be all and end all of climate politics. And I'm very sympathetic to the call for experimentalist governance and experimentalist projects. I think I was concerned that the major example is the Montreal Protocol to phase out CFCs, which happened in 1987 and has been a model for international climate action ever since. And I think what is most concerning to me about that is the really significant difference between CFCs and fossil fuels. And I really think we have to look directly at the fossil fuel industry. It's not sort of, CFCs were a relatively sort of niche chemical. It turned out that there were other chemicals that could be used that were more profitable for many of the industries involved. They weren't sort of the lifeblood of the global economy the way that fossil fuels are. And I think we really have to look at that directly and consider what that means for how we're going to, whether we can trust fossil fuel companies to come to the table as good faith actors. And I see absolutely no evidence that we should do that. They have obviously been notorious funders of, climate denial in the US and also globally. They've tried to scuttle past international agreements. They really, to be frank, even the Green New Deal resolution, this is one of its weaknesses. It doesn't really say anything about fossil fuels or moving away from fossil fuels. And even though Senator Markey laid out this, progression of the development of green energy over the past decade or so, over that same period, the US has become the world's largest producer of oil through the huge expansion of fracking. So all of those are really big problems. If we build out green energy, but we're still using fossil fuels, it doesn't really matter. That was the Obama strategy, all of the above for energy, right? Like, we'll add clean energy, but he wasn't sort of proposing that we really take on oil and gas. And so we have to do that. I just think that there's no way around confronting the fossil fuel industry. And again, I don't really think that we can trust them to be good faith actors in the sense that this model implies. And then I think that the other piece of it is, how do we build sort of a counter power to the fossil fuel industry? And that's where I think the part about building popular power and having, that's what I think the Green New Deal can do, but I think also where we can use experimentalist type projects. So we can, the Green New Deal is like a very big idea and has a lot of pieces. And I think certainly Thea and I and our co-authors and other people who were in conversation would think of it not as like a one and done piece of legislation, but as a like multi-stage, like kind of a new era for politics. I'll also say I'm not particularly wedded sort of on the controversy piece. I'm not particularly wedded to it being called the Green New Deal, if that's going to become like the, I would rather have the stuff happening than it be called the Green New Deal, right? But I think the stuff happening is really important, and we have a lot of opportunities. For example, we've seen a bunch of oil producers go bankrupt over the course of this year. It would be a great time to do something like a big green jobs program to show oil and gas industry workers that there is like a viable green jobs path, that we can really like actually make that just transition happen, because there's been a lot of talk about green jobs, but I think workers are rightfully skeptical that that will actually happen. But right now we have this opportunity, people are already out of work, like to actively, hire those people into green jobs, to start delivering on some of these long-term promises and show that, again, that state action can work to improve people's lives, can deliver material benefits, and can address people's material concerns. And I think that that's what I think is a potentially really exciting thing that we can do with I see that as an experimentalist model, where, you don't have to deliver the entire Green New Deal at once. You can have aspects of it that also that realize it and tangibly, that make people see that something is possible, and that build support and future constituencies for continued action, because we're going to need to have like multiple waves of this over many years, not just like we sneak something through the Senate on like some kind of cobbled together agreement. So I think, I would just draw attention to that as like one potential model. And I think it does actually go some way to address this kind of the problem that the question raised about how do we avoid a kind of COVID repeat. And I think, one of the things that I wish had gone a little differently in the presidential campaign is I think COVID turned into a safety versus economy question, like wearing masks is the only question, and wearing masks was obviously became this hot button issue. But I think that it's really important to say that the response to, Trump really messed up the COVID response from a public health angle, but also failed to provide ongoing income support to address, small business crises, the crises, city and state budget crises, all of these other things that have these economic repercussions that people were really worried about with the lockdowns, and to say like, yeah, like we need to address this public health crisis, but we're going to actually, we have to do that in a way that makes sure people can pay their rent, buy food, all of that stuff. We have to cut off that, like, I'm worried that we'll fall into the same thing with climate unless we have a real vision for how to bring those pieces of like climate action and economic concerns together.
Thanks so much for that. And those issues are going to thread through the issues that you just raised. I'm sure are going to thread through some of the things that Thea and Bob will talk about in reflecting on what their comments on the experimentalist governance. So Thea, in your piece, you talk about this is an issue that's been a big theme in this conversation. These two big political tasks is that there's the movement for socioeconomic equality, and then there's the anti-extractive movement. Those two things, and you said, then I'm going to quote from you here, despite the potential for conflict between them, these two projects are fundamentally intertwined. And I wonder if you could say something on both sides of that. What are the potentials for conflict, and how are they more fundamentally intertwined than at war with one another?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. And I think that I'm gonna answer it in the order that you posed it, but I just want to say that, one of the things that I think is the genius of the Green New Deal framing is that it invites us to think about how they're intertwined, right? But that doesn't mean that there isn't a long history of conflict, whether it's in the US and sort of tensions around labor and environment, which actually Alyssa is more of an expert than me, but like have been, I think, overly dramatized in ways that make, you know, coalition building around a just transition more difficult than it needs to be. But we are familiar with these tensions in the US. But I look at this in the case of Latin America, and so a different region, but I think it raises important questions for US leftists to grapple with too. So what my piece looks at, and it draws on likewise on an excerpt from a book, is that in the early 2000s, there was this really incredible moment in Latin America through sort of like 2014 or so, where lots of left-wing governments came to power. And this was incredible because it was a total sea change in the politics of the region. For like the prior couple of decades, it had been a neoliberal, you know, that notion of development that Bob Hockett, you know, mentioned earlier, that's very market-driven and sort of neoliberal, had been the prevailing kind of theory of economic policy by governments in the region. And so there's this total change in the early 2000s where lots of progressive governments come to power at once. And what's interesting, and this kind of reiterates stuff that I said earlier in response to Senator Markey, is that movements didn't demobilize. They kept pressing those governments, and they pressed them in different ways towards different ends in different contexts. But in the case that I look at in Ecuador, what's really interesting for our purposes is that they pressed the government on environmental issues, right? So like the main point of conflict between movements in Ecuador and the left-wing government that in many ways they had critically supported when it came to power was the issue of resource extraction, of environmental harm, of pollution, of contamination that are all related to the extractive model of economic development that prevails really across the global South, where there's intensified resource extraction, often to serve ultimately consumers in the global North, right? So this is embedded in a whole global system, which I'll come back to in a moment. But protest movement said, you know, we got you into power, Correa, the president at the time, and like now we are going to hold you accountable on this issue of resource extraction. And, you know, there was really deep polarization. It's interesting because it was, and actually to echo something David Victor said earlier around like sort of warfare in the Democratic Party, this was an intra-left debate. Like it was a leftist in power and it was leftists in the streets, and they disagreed over resource extraction. And what I ultimately say at the very end of my book, after going through like all of the points of tension and the different arguments that these different forces on the left put forward. So the clear environmental argument I already detailed, like on the part of movements, and then on the part of the government, they were saying, well, we have historically high prices for oil and minerals, and there's a lot of poverty in Ecuador, and we need to use those revenues to address social needs, which is also something movements had demanded in the past, right? So the government had, you know, whether or not you agree with it, like a coherent argument as well. And it was really like kind of at loggerheads. And what I conclude in the book is, you know, just for a sort of generous kind of takeaway after detailing the conflict, is that I see both of these as necessary. And the reason but not the extractive model of development, but both having leftist governments in power that can address people's material needs through policy and vociferous anti-extractive protest. Without the anti-extractive protest in Ecuador, there would have been more rapacious resource extraction, right? Like they actually managed to stall several projects and slow down several projects that would have contributed to local environmental harm and to climate change through tropical deforestation, which is the second, you know, most important cause of climate change after fossil fuel burning. So they're really vital locally and globally. But, you know, as many have already pointed out on the panel and stuff I said earlier as well, like without having the left in power, to Alyssa's point, like you can't convince people that you can address these existential crises in ways that actually materially benefit them, right? You can't build popular support. But the issue in Ecuador, and this now immediately highlights the contrast between the US and Ecuador, is that this wasn't really a solvable problem at the scale of Ecuador, right? Because Ecuador occupies this peripheral position in the global economy, is an oil exporter that doesn't have like immediate other economic resources to transition to. And so it sort of highlights like the complicity of the world system and of like global power relations in Ecuador being in such a difficult position where even a leftist government couldn't address, you know, environmental, or felt like they couldn't address environmental concerns without forsaking the revenues that would address people's material concerns, right? And so the US is not in that position. The US is not in a position where that's the choice that needs to be made. But I think that it does speak to the fact that for the global South and for especially like low income oil and mineral exporting states, this tension between material like needs of poor people and of like environmental need and indigenous communities and environmental justice communities, that fundamental tension can't be solved without regional and global shifts, both like shifting away from a fossil fuel dependent economy, but also like posing some pretty like I think urgent but also maybe radical sounding demands around like global debt and around a variety of the sort of economic constraints that global South countries find themselves in. So one of the reasons I'm hopeful about the Green New Deal is not just about the domestic changes it could kind of bring to bear, but also the ways that it might shift something about the global political economy, open up more space, and I think, you know, ultimately, I think we should think of things like canceling sovereign debt as like a demand that is part of like the Green New Deal and a global Green New Deal, right? And that's like a big ambitious thing, but I just want to sort of put it on the table because I think that, again, like tensions that feel very irreconcilable in certain contexts are less irreconcilable in the US. Not that they don't exist, but I think we do need to think globally about those global power relations so that every country in the world can embark on a just transition.
Thanks so much for adding that in, the global piece, particularly at the end there, Thea. That's great. Bob, there's a question in chat that leads directly into the question that I wanted to ask you that comes out of your response in the book. Alex Jacob says, how do you see the public, private, and community sectors intersecting, interacting in the fight for climate mitigation? And in your piece in the book, you are enthusiastic about experimentalism. You say that's what the Green New Deal was about, and I kind of helped to design it, so I know something like that. And you talk about how now the Sunrise and Justice Democrats and others are building collections of local projects to hand off to President Biden, and not just as a kind of heap of ideas, but you use this phrase, you talk about a structured synthesis that comes out of those local conversations, that connects local action with national and, as Thea says, global. So could you say more about this? I mean, how are projects being generated and how are they being synthesized into what you call the national GND, Green New Deal binder?
Great. Yeah. So happily, this sort of picks up themes that David laid out and that Alyssa laid out and then that Thea laid out. So maybe the best way to approach it is by looking at the phrase Green New Deal again. Another brilliant thing about the framing of it is not only does it capture, the sort of green side of things by the use of the word green, and then the kind of industrial policy side of things by the phrase New Deal, but it also kind of implicitly carries something else with that phrase New Deal. We can think of the New Deal on the one hand as a massive case of industrial policy done continentally and done right. But we can also think of it as a political process, right? The Green New Deal, to pick up a theme that Alyssa noted, it wasn't a one and done thing, right? There wasn't sort of just a big piece of legislation that was passed called the New Deal Act, like the Dodd-Frank Act or the, whatever act, the ACA. In fact, it was a sequence of enactments, a kind of a rolling sequence of enactments, each one of which kind of built on its predecessors, and each one of which sort of incorporated lessons learned not only from successes of its predecessors, but also from failures of its predecessors. So one way to think of the Green New Deal, I think, is as being a bit like the original New Deal in the sense that it's more a process that will unfold over the course of a decade than anything else. Once we start thinking of it as a process, that invites us to think about certain elements or attributes of the process as well. And another attribute of the New Deal itself that was very imperfectly executed, but that we can get right this time, was at least in ideal, it was meant to be kind of bottom-up democratic as much as it was top-down technocratic. In other words, there was a great deal of local participation in the determination of what were the most compelling needs, and hence what were the most urgently needed projects for the New Deal to pursue. And that was partly, I think, owing to the sort of idealism of a lot of the New Dealers, but it was also owing to a very simple and straightforward political calculation that really resonates nicely with some of the points that Thea just made, and that resonates nicely with aspects of the Sunrise Movement, the Justice Democrats, the DSA, and other organizations that are sort of part of the grassroots of the Green New Deal as well. And that is that, the New Deal was successful in part because it had projects going on in literally every congressional district of the country, right? Everybody had a Green New Deal. Everybody had a New Deal project or more, right? Or every district, I should say. And that was on the one hand, good politics. It was savvy, it was smart, it was a way of getting a broad base of support, but it could also be just said to be part of what it is for it to be democratic or for it to be just. Now, that being said, of course, it was notoriously racist in its implementation, and it was notoriously sexist in its implementation. But I would suggest, and I doubt that many people would disagree with this, that was more bug than feature, right? That was owing to the fact that you had racists implementing it. It wasn't sort of written into the DNA of the New Deal itself. And certainly we have the capacity this time around to ensure that it doesn't have those elements, if for no other reason than that the Democratic Party no longer has to make peace with Southern Democrats who are Jim Crowers. All the Jim Crowers are Republicans now. It almost seems like all the Republicans are Jim Crowers as well. So we can pretty much figure, all right, let's see if we could peel away the few non-Jim Crowers in the Republican Party, and then we can form an actual majority coalition that goes forward. Now, getting back then to the more specific question that you asked, Josh, one of the great advantages of the role that the Sunrise Movement and the Justice Democrats and the DSA and other groups are playing in all of this is that it's very easy for all of us who are sort of part of the movement to connect up with our colleagues. I'm a member of, on the one hand, the Ithaca Sunrise Group, and on the other hand, the New York City Sunrise Group, because I'm sort of bi-located. I live in both cities. It's easy for us to connect up with our comrades in the other chapters all over the country, and then arrange for there to be town hall meetings or town hall style meetings, repeated such meetings in every locality of the country, sort of by analogy to the, every district in the country that we found in the case of the New Deal, and hold meetings to get people's assessments of what's most urgently needed. And the way that we're sort of doing this is we say, it's almost like a Christmas list. I mean, it's like we're saying, or a wish list. We just say, imagine, Santa Claus is going to come in and give you guys $1 million or $500 million or 600, depending on the size of the locality. What would you want to do with that to basically upgrade the economy in this area in a way that's consistent, again, with planetary survival and with racial justice and environmental justice and the like? And what we're doing is we're then compiling these into these binders that it's basically, we're calling it the Green New Deal wish list project. And then the hope is that over time we could refine this, because that's essentially the bottom up aspect of it. And I'll be really quick. The top down aspect, obviously, is that you need some kind of coordination at the national level, in the sense that you don't want projects in one locality to be operating at cross purposes, right, with projects in another locality. And sort of similarly, you don't want needless duplication, right? If you've got like one large metro area that wants to do X project, and it is actually already going to do for this smaller village that's sort of part of the greater metro area what it itself would put on its own wish list, well, then why have it twice? Why not say, hey, you guys can come up with something else, because you're already going to get that, because the larger metro area wants to do that too. So in other words, you need some kind of a collation and some kind of, again, a collaborative synthesis that at the top, and I sort of analogize this to the role of the orchestra conductor. The conductor doesn't tell people what to do or what to play, but he sort of keeps time, or she keeps time, to ensure that everybody's kind of in sync. And that's where the synthesis, I think, comes in, right? So that's the sort of short playing, breathlessly articulated version. If we had a little bit more time, we could go into a bit more detail, but I hope that's at least partly responsive also to our questioner. I'd say a little bit more about public-private and the relation between those, but that's probably sufficiently distinct as a subject. And since we're almost out of time, maybe I should table that for later.
Okay, thanks. Thanks so much for that's what we at MIT we used to call a fire hose lecture, and it's a term of praise. Fire hose. Yeah. Look, we started a little bit late because Senator Markey was busy doing good things, and so we're going to go for about another 10 minutes or so. We have a huge number of great questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to go right to the questions, and I want to I've picked up on a couple of them already. I want to put one on the table, and maybe David, you could say something about it. that Carl Wirtz has asked in a couple of different ways about nuclear energy. So where does nuclear power fit into your sense, either of the, the solution to the climate problem, experimentalism, Green New Deal? What's your view on?
Yeah, so my view on that is volumes of energy are huge. Volumes of needed energy are huge, and we need a lot of low carbon energy. And so a lot of it's going to be renewables, but not all of it's going to be renewables. And nuclear is a contender. I think it's really important in this country to distinguish between the existing fleet of nuclear plants, where the economics of keeping them open as low carbon solutions are very clear, almost every case, versus new build, where the costs are pretty high. The other thing I'd say just quickly about nuclear is this is an area where experimentalism is now playing a big role, because nuclear plants used to be built so that they just ran flat out all the time. And now what you're seeing in the places that have the most renewables is the operators of the plants, France is a great example, are learning how to run the plants up and down during the day, so that in effect, the plants become clean, firm power that helps integrate renewables. And that's what's very clear from all of the modeling of power grids, is that if you want to bring a lot of renewables onto the grid, you need clean, firm power to help integrate it, to help deal with long periods of wind and solar drought and so on. And nuclear is one contender for playing that role. And then the value of that role goes up dramatically the more renewables on the grid.
Yeah. I think instead of inviting others to say, I was going to invite somebody to disagree, but I think I'll I want to bring in some more. There is a question, I have to find it again now. I was particularly drawn to the question because it's from David Hughes, who's written some fantastic stuff from Boston Review, unless it's another David Hughes, happens to have the same name and an interest in rural protest in Spain and Germany.
Oh, I found it, I think.
Spain
In Spain and Germany, yeah.
Yeah, Spain and Germany, rural protest has virtually halted the installation of new onshore wind farms. What can we learn from this sobering experience in Europe?
Yeah, I'll just take it quickly, and I'm curious to hear what others have to say. And actually, what I am curious about is how people, whoever else answers this question, thinks that this changes with the dynamics of offshore wind, and thinking about how like community acceptance and economic benefits can be derived from projects when they're not actually sited, in people's immediate backyards. But in terms of the projects that are in people's backyards, what I've learned from like a bit of comparative research on how communities respond to wind projects is that the policies and the relationships make all the difference. I mean, it's actually like there's no reason to believe that people just don't like wind, right? They don't like projects that come out of nowhere from firms that never consulted anybody, from that they don't economically benefit from or don't have any ownership stakes in and don't get any jobs out of, right? But like basically when all of those values are positive, when there is like some form of community ownership, when there's some kind of economic dividend, when there's job creation, and when there's community involvement in the design and deployment of the project, generally they go well. I mean, I'm simplifying a bit, but that's what I've come to understand. And I think that, what that I think might speak to at a deeper level is that, is there a tension, and we talk about this quite a bit in the book, A Planet to Win, like, is there a tension between like the speed and scale of deployment and democracy? And we could talk about that, but I think that on the flip side, when projects don't have that element of democracy, and I mean that both politically but also economically in terms of the distribution of benefits, then people protest them, so then they don't go forward at all, right? So I think that even if it takes a little more time to sort of build in those elements, ultimately you'll get more deployment if you can design projects that will be actually accepted by people.
Thank you. And let me, this is a question, and there are variants of it, a number of different variants of it in the Q&A. I'll just pick one from Jeff Pfeiffer. And he says he's wondering if you, Alyssa, and others as well, have a sense for the ways that some of the just transition stuff that was just being discussed earlier can bring folks along who might otherwise work against the Green New Deal. We have so much evidence that folks will still vote against progressive policies even when they benefit from them. This seems the hardest thing to overcome as the Green New Deal's legislative processes get going. And so, there's the opposition from fossil fuels, but this is, I think, pretty much different piece. What's your thinking about that? And as I say, I picked that one example of it, but there are about 5 variants of that really, really fundamental question in chat. Alyssa, why don't you?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a tough question. I mean, I think there's a couple things to say. I mean, I think there's always going to be some people who you have to, I guess, overwhelm at the ballot box. There's some people who like are not going to come around, and you have to just kind of accept that and say, okay, we're like, how do we beat the fossil fuel industry? How do we win enough people over to our side to institute this legislative program? So that is, I think, true for some number of people, but I also think there's a lot more room to move people than maybe the question suggests. So maybe people vote against some policies that would benefit them, but I think there's also a lot of mismatch between the who people vote for in terms of politicians and what policies they want. And we saw this, for example, in the most recent election in Florida, where Donald Trump won the state, but voters overwhelmingly voted for a $15 minimum wage, which is like a Biden and Democratic and progressive Democratic policy that's been put on the table by unions, by progressive activists in the Democratic Party. And that used to be kind of this oh, that's too far idea. And so I think there is actually probably, and if you look actually a lot of the components of the Green New Deal in polling, they're popular in polls, and we all know that polls are not we don't want to lean too hard on polls, right? But I think there actually is substantial support for a lot of the pieces of these things. There has been a lot of progress, I think, within the labor movement on the just transition, green jobs piece specifically, and I think there's increasing, there's still tensions within the labor movement, but I think there's a lot more. I think there's both a lot more support for something like a Green New Deal and a Green Jobs program that's substantive than I think than there has been. And also, there are the number of fossil fuel workers themselves is relatively small in the scheme of things. So I think it's not those workers themselves are going to, I think that can kind of become a totemic issue for all of a jobs versus environment kind of issue. But I think we need to both figure out how we transition those folks, but also how not sort of be distracted by I guess some of the I guess groups who take up a lot of space and discourse, but may not be the sort of driving determinants of whether we can get some of these things passed or make some of these things happen. So I think there's more space to move, basically.
One more example really quickly here, Josh. So the traditional environmental movement probably wouldn't have been associated in people's minds with public housing, right? We probably would have thought, well, that's just sort of a Birkenstock wearer's thing. It's a sort of a luxury problem that luxuriating people sort of concern themselves with. But now, of course, that's very obviously not the case. And one of the first sort of major pieces of legislation that I helped AOC's folk out with after the Green New Deal resolution itself is the Public Housing Green New Deal Act, which any of you can find out on the web. And it's a major piece. We wrote, I can't remember how many pages we ended up filling up with the legislation itself, but it involved, a lot of people maybe don't realize how much in the way of environmental abatement work and environmental repurposing or rebuilding is left to be done in public housing complexes in every major metro area of the country. And there's a lot of room for improvement, or a lot of room for basically what I guess we can call green capture, as it were, in these particular units. But it's also a fantastic kind of democratic housing opportunity as well, because in order to make all of this stuff happen, the way we've tried to design it is that the residents themselves will be taking charge, right? There will be new positions within the housing units whereby people organize in order to oversee the actual refurbishment and the rehabilitation of their own units. And this is just, again, one example that might strike some people as marginal, but it's actually pretty big. And what's amazing is that for everything of this kind, there must be 100 more examples that people haven't thought of, right? It really is sector by sector with a huge multitude of sectors that are going to be covered.
Great, thanks. Thanks very much for that. We're almost out of time as my dog is reporting. And I was going to ask you to answer, Bob, a question from Dennis McLean, who pays for the Green New Deal? But instead, what I'm going to do is, just because we're out of time, I'm just going to suggest that Bob could that Dennis could have a look at your book on financing the Green New Deal, which is sort of how it is a monograph answering the question how it's paid for.
Precisely.
I recommend it.
Yeah.
David, I'm going to give you the last word if you've got any last words.
Maybe I'll say two last words very briefly.
Two last words, okay.
One is I've just struck, first of all, it's been a great pleasure to write this piece and work with your team and work with all of the respondents, and the discussion has been really, really profoundly insightful. I'll just say two things. One is I'm really struck by how the politics are very plastic. That industrial groups that we used to think would be opposed to this, like utilities that burn coal, have figured out new interests. They figured out how to become wires companies, to be thrilled about renewables and all kinds of other things. And so the pressure is working. It's showing companies that they have to make transformative change. The second thing I just want to close with is, to me, one of the most striking things about the Green New Deal, and the politics in the country are difficult. And even if both seats in Georgia go to the Democrats, the median voter in the Senate is going to be, Joe Manchin or Mark Kelly. I mean, this is not Green New Dealers. But there's going to be a process that's going to unfold. But to me, what's been most striking to watch this is that the idea is taking off in other countries. So we now have a European Green Deal with many of the elements, and it's actually happening. We have a Korean version of the Korean Green Deal. And the climate problem is a global problem. The U.S. emissions are, 15% or so of global. And so we have to act here. There's no question about it, but we have to find ways to replicate leadership and success, and this is one of the ideas that's taking off.
Great, thanks so much for those great concluding comments, David, and thanks everybody for participating in the conversation. And Chris, I hope those the 8th graders that you brought from the McCormick School in Boston got some fresh ideas from this. I think people here would like to hear their fresh ideas. It's wonderful that you were able to bring them. Kate, I'm gonna, and thanks to the audience, and sorry we didn't get to all your questions. There are lots of amazing, interesting, and very deep questions in chat. So thank you all for coming. Kate, I'm gonna hand it back to you.
Thank you. I really don't want this event to end. Thank you, all of you tremendously, our panelists, to Josh Cohen, and to Senator Markey for this inspiring and informative discussion. And thank you to everyone out there for spending your evening learning and asking such insightful questions from home. I have included in the chat one last time, but feel free to learn more and purchase Climate Action from Boston Review at the link that I've provided. So on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, Boston Review, have a good night. Always, always keep reading, and please be well, everyone. Take care.